Okay, thank you. Well, thanks all for being here. So this talk is based on this book which just came out recently, and the issue is that it's something of a paradox that the mindless working of physical interactions can underlie the emergence of mind through the functioning of the brain. A physical mechanism underlies intelligence. I'm going to suggest this is possible only because of the way causation works and the hierarchy of complexity in the physical world. Physics underlies chemistry, biochemistry in the mind, but top-down processes allow emergence of true complexity such as ourselves. The underlying physical laws enable what happens rather than determining the outcome. That's an important sentence. And we're interested in real complexity such as ourselves. Now, just to be quite clear, I've split this into two talks. This talk aims to explain the concept and how it works in many contexts, giving sufficient examples to hopefully convince you that it does indeed work and it has to be taken seriously. The next talk, which is on Wednesday, aims to deal with more nuts and bolts issues. In particular, it'll characterize 5 different types of top-down causation that occur. It'll relate it to Aristotle's kinds of cause, and it'll deal with 2 common objections: causal closure of physics at the bottom and supervenience of higher levels on lower levels. So I will deal with those next time around. This time I just want to get the idea across, and I hope I will persuade you by sufficient examples that it must be true. So we want to deal with real complexity, and this famous quote by Francis Crick in his book about the brain: "You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." So he's saying this is the real thing and that's not the real thing in some sense or other. Now, I will give you a complete response to Crick at the end of this session. This is his reductionist paradigm, and it's wrong. So the context: all real complexity happens in modular hierarchical structures, and each word is important. It's structures. Structures create possibilities by symmetry breaking. Creating structures constrain what is possible. They have to be modular. Modularity allows abstraction and information hiding. Interfaces matter. Internal information is only used locally and is hidden from outside, and it has to be hierarchical. Emergent levels of structure occur, each with their own variables and effective laws of behavior. I'll say a bit more about each of these next time. This comes from a wonderful book by H.A. Simon called The Sciences of the Artificial, which lays some of this out. But the claim I'm going to make is that the emergent higher levels are real. In physical sciences side, they're characterized by scale or energy. On the life sciences side, that's true at the bottom, but at the top it gets more complicated. They're characterized by causation rather than scale or energy, as I will explain. And when I say there's bottom-up and top-down causation, there may or may not be a topmost or a bottommost level. I'm not claiming particularly that we know a topmost level in the mind, because we don't. And we certainly don't know a bottommost level in physics. And so this is interlevel. It's between different levels of the hierarchy. It's not a statement about the highest or the lowest levels. So here's the hierarchy: particle physics, atomic physics, chemistry, biochemistry, cell biology, botany, zoology, physiology, psychology, sociology, economics, politics. This is the life sciences hierarchy. There's a similar one for the natural sciences hierarchy. Now, bottom-up causation alone, and this is the paradigm which physicists have basically taught us to think about, and it's been taken over by a lot of biologists and other people. Bottom-up causation alone is what happens. Microforces determine what happens at the higher levels. At higher levels structure, new properties emerge from the lower level components, new kinds of variables and laws come into being, but they are determined by bottom-up causation, which occurs between each pair of levels, and hence it chains from the bottom upwards. And so in principle, what I'm saying to you at the moment is determined by particle physics. And so for instance, microphysics underlies macrophysics, the kinetic theory of gases being one of the great milestones in this. Physics underline chemistry, the nature of the chemical bond being another of the great milestones in this understanding. Physics and chemistry underlying the functioning of the brain, another of the great later milestones. And so these have been wonderful successes of this bottom-up approach. However, contextual effects also occur when the higher levels of the hierarchy causally affect what happens at lower levels in a coordinated way, and this happens between layers and so chains down. And so what you're getting as well, I'm claiming, is that there are also top-down effects, and what is then very important is you then get closed loops between, loops between the different levels, and it's those loops where the bottom level affects the higher and the higher affects the lower. That's what enables real complexity to come into being. So an example is epigenetics. We've had the epigenetic revolution in the past 20 or so years. Epigenetics determine what happens in cell biology. Cell processes initiate chemical cycles. We now know a huge amount more about developmental biology than we used to know. The mind controls physiological events such as walking. When I walk like this, my mind is telling my feet how to move. How does it do that? It sends signals to the muscles. That works by, in effect, my brain telling electrons to flow through the muscle tissue in a particular kind of way. So when I'm walking, my mind is telling electrons how to behave. I'm talking in a slightly analogical way, but nevertheless, in essence, it's a correct way of saying what happens. Now, contextual effects in the hierarchical causation works by setting constraints for lower level causation. So all of this works by setting constraints. You are not overwriting the lower level of physics. You're not saying physics has been undermined by this. You're saying physics is channeled by this. It's a very different thing. So what happens is higher level structures channel interactions, and paradoxically channeling things creates possibilities. If you have a gas interacting, all you get is pressure, density and temperature. Nothing much very interesting happens. When you channel it like you do in a computer in our brain, much more interesting happens. So it's the channeling which enables complexity to occur. So constraint creates possibilities. Now the initial higher level state influences the dynamics, and one of the way to tell top-down causation is taking place is you've got a higher level variable, you change it, and it changes the lower level processes and developmental outcomes. So it's an experimental thing, and the classic is a thermostat. The thermostat controls a heater and hence affects the speed of molecules in a room. If you change the setting, move that, that's a macro level change. It will change what's happening in a furnace, that will change the temperature, that'll change the velocities of molecules down there in the gas in the room. And so that is a top-down effect from this lever here down to the motion of molecules in the room. And so that's a classical example of a top-down effect. As I've said, structures constrain and so channel causal effects. You get reliable behavior of complex systems like a computer arises from this carefully designed structure, and you all are fairly familiar with this. Now, the really important thing about these structures is in each of these wires, it's not so much the resistance along the wire. What matters is the resistance perpendicular to the wire is effectively infinite. In other words, it channels the causation from there through to there because it makes the causation travel along the wire and not any other direction. So it's the fact that the resistance is infinite sideways, which is actually the really important point there. And then here's the brain. Again, it's got all of these interacting things, and again, signals are traveling along these nerve fibers from one place to another. Now, one of the things about a really complex system like that, the micro details essentially alter the macro behavior. In a gas, it doesn't matter if you mess around with the molecules, the gas is still behaving like a gas. If you rewire a couple of those wires, the whole thing won't function properly. So one of the things with these real complex systems is that it depends on the detail of that wiring. And one of the things in relation to physics, you can't coarse grain to determine the macro behavior. You can't take this system there and somehow do a coarse graining process to tell you how it's going to behave, because that's not possible. And that's one of the differences from statistical physics. Now, boundary and structural conditions shape causal effects, and these are two physics examples. One of the very famous ones is hearing the shape of a drum. The drum has got a particular shape, and it's a classic example in applied mathematics or physics. Can you, listening to the tone, hear the shape of the drum? And the answer is to some degree you can. It's because the shape of the drum fixes the eigenfunctions, and that makes the motion up and down of the particles in the drum's skin behave in a certain way. And if the shape was different, the oscillations of the particles in the skin would be different. And a violin, again, the shape of the violin is very important in determining how the air molecules vibrate. And so you spend huge sums of money on a really good violin if you want to get a really good outcome. What you're doing is you're fixing the boundary conditions for the strings of the violin and for the particles in the string. One of the very, very interesting areas at the moment where you're getting top-down effects in a fascinating way is topological effects in physics. And there's a special issue of Nature Physics about this a few weeks ago, and there's a Reviews of Modern Physics article about all of this. And these are top-down because what you're getting here is you're getting certain molecular crystalline structures which create band gaps and shape how electrons flow in these articles, and so the flow of electrons in this crystal is fixed by the crystalline structure. So it's top-down action from the scale of crystalline structures, which has got certain symmetries, down to the flow of electrons at the level below. And it turns out that this can be characterized in certain terms of certain topological features, which one can read about. And this is a very active area at the present time. Now, in physics, one of the most important and interesting is the arrow of time. And the arrow of time, the problem here is entropy increases to the future, but it doesn't exist in reversible microphysics. The microphysics of Maxwell's equations and gravitational equations and so on is time reversible. And given data here, you don't know in which direction it will go. You don't know which direction the second law of thermodynamics will go. And microphysics is time symmetric. The future and past are equal. How does macrophysics know the direction of time? Because from a bottom-up view, they're equal. And the answer, the second law of thermodynamics says that entropy will increase in the future direction of time. But one of the great discoveries, once Ludwig Boltzmann proved the second law of thermodynamics from the underlying physics, but it was then pointed out to him that his proof applied equally in both directions of times. And so you could deduce that entropy would increase in the future direction of time. Applying exactly the same proof proves that entropy increases in the past direction of time. This is Loschmidt's paradox. And the answer appears to be, at least most people believe, that there are global initial conditions in the universe that determine the local arrow of time. And this will be what I will be talking about a bit on Friday. But you cannot get the direction of time in physics. And so if you try to derive chemistry out of physics or anything, one of the great lacunas is that the physics at the micro levels, the fundamental equations do not have the arrow of time in them, and yet the macro one does. And in order to get that, you need a global condition which says the special conditions at the beginning of the universe in order to get the arrow of time coming out of the underlying physics. As I say, I'll be saying a bit more about that on Friday. Now, the take-home message is that contextual effects occur in physics when you look for them. This fact is obscured by the ideal of laboratory experiments on isolated systems. And because we always talk about a laboratory experiment in an isolated system, somehow we are... That puts us in a frame of mind where we think only of the bottom-up effects. But actually, no physical systems are isolated. And in fact, if you think of the laboratory and collider experiments, they are examples of top-down action from the mind to the system under investigation. If you take the Large Hadron Collider, why did those particles collide in the Large Hadron Collider and give us those measurements, which then led us to believe that the Higgs particle existed? Well, the reason those particles collided is because the collider was designed and made by the human mind. And so, in fact, the LHC is a wonderful example of top-down action from the human mind to the colliders, to the collisions of the particles. All right, all biology is contextual. Both the writing and the reading of biological information takes place in an explicitly top-down way. This is the core of both evolution and of developmental biology. The reason, why does biology have to be top-down, is that living beings must adapt to their environment. In order that a living being can adapt to environment, information must flow from the environment into the organism to tell it what to adapt to. And then this information must alter its structure and functioning. And so adaptation of an organism depends on the organism knowing about the environment. So information on the environment must flow into the organism. This is a top-down process of adaptive selection relying on the contextual nature of biological processes, and it's for these reasons that life cannot emerge in a purely bottom-up way. You can get self-assembly of simple biomolecules, you can get self-assembly of little vesicles into which things can go. You can get a certain amount of self-assembly, but my claim is that you cannot get life to come into being in a purely bottom-up way. At some level, adaptive selection has to start, which leads to the top-down process, which allows life to then go through a Darwinian evolutionary process. And my colleagues, Paul Davies and Sarah Walker, agree with me in this, that life cannot emerge in a purely bottom-up way. And we can discuss this further perhaps later on. So the origin of biological information, the development of DNA coding, the particular sequence of bases in the DNA takes place through an evolutionary process, Darwinian evolution, which results in adaptation of the organism to its ecological niche. This is a classical case of top-down action from the environment to detail biological microstructure. Through the process of Darwinian adaptation based on random mutations, the environment, along with other factors, fixes the specific DNA coding. There's no way that you can predict the DNA coding on the basis of biochemistry or microphysics alone. If you go to a physicist and say, predict to me the DNA coding in a polar bear, he can't do it, right? If you go to a microbiologist, they can't do it either. You can't even ask the appropriate questions in their language. This is the way that new information comes into biological processes, and it's unpredictable because a random element occurs in the Darwinian process. There's a random shuffling of the genes, and then you select the ones which work. There's that random element, and that's then allows you to select between them. So this bear is white because its environment is white. Through natural selection, top-down action of the environment codes information about appropriate responses to the environment in the detailed base sequence. So in this case, the environment is white. In effect, that tells the animal it's a pretty good idea to be white if you want to survive in this environment. If it was in the Canadian forest, it would be black, but here it's white. And that goes into the DNA sequence through the processes of Darwinian evolution. So the DNA sequence, in a certain way, is a mirror of the environment. And so what you're getting is the ecological context goes into the detailed coding of the DNA bases. So the writing of genetic information takes place in a top-down way because the environment sets the niches which determine what's good for the animal and therefore what are good genes to have and what aren't. Now the reading of that information are epigenetic processes that also take place in an explicitly top-down way. And that's the core of developmental biology. Which specific gene gets read when and where is controlled by the developmental context. You see, the problem facing an organism is that every single cell has got exactly the same DNA in it with all the same information. So how does a cell know whether to become a bit of skin or bone or blood or a neuron or what? How does it know that? Okay, well, what happens is there are biological markers carrying positional information. In effect, the body as a whole, the developing body, feeds positional information, and that turns the genes on and off according to where in the body the developing cell is. So according to this beautiful book, Ecological Developmental Biology, Integrating Epigenetics, Medicine and Evolution by Gilbert and Eppel, environmental agents can result in changes to an individual's phenotype, that's to the growing animal, often implemented when signals from the environment elicit epigenetic changes in gene expression. Changes in chromosome structure that alter gene expression can be induced by environmental agents and transmitted across generations. And so the developing body adapts to the situation it is in. Perhaps one of the simplest examples is plants or trees. They develop in a different way if there's a drought or a flood situation, and what happens to them if it's very, very hot or very cold, and they develop differently in those cases. Dennis Noble is the person who did the first multi-level model of the heart, a wonderful model, numerical model simulating the structure of the heart. And he's written about this in a beautiful book called The Music of Life. He's developed this multi-level model of the heart, which crucially requires top-down organization. And what happens there, the organism triggers cell signaling in various kinds of ways. The organs and tissues turn genes on and off through sending signals down to them, and the protein machinery selects, reads, and corrects genes through gene regulatory networks. And so explicitly this works. And then he's got this model of the heart where he can model all the different pressures and the action potentials and so on. It's a very, very detailed model, and in order to make this work, he must model all of the different levels, and he has to model, to make a complete model, he has to model the way all of these levels actually, because this is from a paper of his, and so his multi-level model models the genes, the proteins, and so on, through to the tissue level and the organ, which in this specific case is the heart. So physiology works in a top-down way because through the cycles of the heart, the genes are turning on and off in a way which enables that cycle to take place. And if they don't take place in the way that they should, you're in trouble. In ecology, it's all of ecology has also got bottom-up and top-down components, again, because animals are adapting to their environment. And there's something called trophic cascades. Robert Payne demonstrated on a rocky shore that the top predator controlled both its prey and affected most of the other species in the community. From this, he developed the idea of trophic cascades, the rippling down through the community of strong top-down effects that affect multiple ecosystems, levels, and species. This comes from his obituary in Nature just a few weeks ago. The take-home message is that top-down causation is ubiquitous in biology, from ecosystem scale down to the scale of molecular biology. The molecular biology being when the genes are being read. This has to be so because biological systems are adaptive. They need an information flow from the environment to shape their behavior and hence their structure. Now, computers are a fantastic example because, unlike biology, which is really complex, computers are complex, but we understand them perfectly because we've built them. So we know exactly what is happening in computers. And computers have a hierarchy which is described by Tannenbaum like this. A global network, local network, the computer, the motherboard, memory banks, the CPU, memory circuits, arithmetic logic unit, primary memory, the bus, the logic circuits and registers, the transistors, resistors and capacitors, down to atoms, nucleons, quarks and superstrings if you go into those levels. Now, the average computer scientist stops at level 0 and does not go down to the lower levels. They take them for granted. But this is the kind of hierarchy, and I've already shown you some pictures of that. That's the hardware side, but the computer, if you've just got the computer, it sits there, it doesn't do anything until you feed it with some software. Now, in parallel with the hierarchical structure of the hardware, so here was the hierarchical structure of the software, of the hardware, through from the individual chips through to the integrated circuits, through to the computer, through to the kind of whole network sort of stuff. Parallel to that, the software also has a hierarchical structure. Applications, program, problem-oriented language level, assembly language level, operating system, machine level, instruction set, architecture level, microarchitecture level, digital logical level, and device level. And this is what is described by Tannenbaum in his book about that. And the question is, what determines how a computer functions? And my answer is that the software and the data power the hardware. The outcome depends on the specific software and data, and they are abstract entities. That's a point that I'm going to emphasize. So what happens is all the higher levels are virtual machines. They're not physical systems. In fact, if you read the literature on this, for instance, there's a Java virtual machine. And the Java virtual machine, it's a virtual machine. It's not a physical one. The only physical one is the bottom one, level 0, and on top of that, you pile these conceptual higher level virtual machines, each with its own language, its own set of instructions, its own set of rules, which are rigorously obeyed. What is important here is the same software at the higher level can be written in many different languages at the lower levels, like you might use Java or you might not use it. You can change your chip from different chips with different instruction sets at the bottom, and you can get the same output at the top level with many different implementations at the bottom level. It's this multiple realizability at the lower level which says it's the abstract stuff at the higher level which is the really important one. All of these lower ones are representations of an abstract entity, and the same abstract entity, the same program or the same algorithm, gets rewritten in different languages, each of them being a representation of the same logical structure. So the same logical structure is rewritten, for instance, it might be written in Fortran, and it might be rewritten in Java, it might be rewritten in assembly language. The logical structure is the same at every level, and it's the logical structure which is deciding what the computer will do. As you go down, you can get many different ways of doing this. You have to feed in, given the software, the general programs, you have to feed in a specific set of programs, subroutines, algorithms, and so on for the particular problem you have at hand, and the data structures, classes, objects, data, words, bytes, bits, and at the bottom you've got your electrons flowing through the gates. So you've got the software, the programs, but then you've got you've got the specific program you've written. For instance, in Fortran, you now write a specific program in Fortran, and that program will have subroutines, algorithms, macros, and all the rest of it. And what happens here is that the software drives the hardware. The hardware's got the gates and electrons flowing through the gates, but you decide if you load in a word processing program or a music program, a picture program, whatever it is, you load that in at the top and you load in the data, and that then cascades down. And what causes the cascading down? And the answer is cascade down through compilers or interpreters. And the real hero of the computer revolution was Grace Hopper, who wrote the first compilers. And so in fact, this isn't just an abstract kind of thing. If you ask me, how does the stuff cascade down? The answer is it cascades down through compilers. It goes down until it's the level of electrons, and then the electrons flow through the gate to fulfill the algorithms which you've put in at the top, and then it goes back up again and prints it out. And another example which makes this, well, so the way I would put this is the following. The software, abstract entities shape the interactions. Software is not a physical thing. It is realized or instantiated as energetic states in a computer memory. Those states are not a physical object. They're instantiated by electrons being in particular places at a particular time, but they're not the same as those electrons. Just like a story is not the same as the paper on which it is written. It is the pattern of the electrons that matters. Given the set of connections in the CPU, this pattern represents the logical structure of the program. It's the logical structure of the program that's the key causal element in the sense of determining what happens next at each instant. The specific realization is what enables us to work, but a different realization could have been used. So there is a logical structure in your program, whatever it is you're trying to do. That is embodied in the applications program, and then the specific program you've written in. That cascades down until it gets a set of instructions at the machine level. It makes specific electrons flow through specific gates. The electrons are obeying Maxwell's equations, they're obeying Schrödinger's equations, they're obeying all the laws of physics you like. Those laws are not deciding what happens. What's deciding what happens is the logic. And so this is an example of what you get out of it. You can see there the multi-level thing that's taking place. This is a typical example. Through this kind of process, you get the design of an aircraft. And a particularly clear way of seeing how this works is computer networking between two different computers, a source and a destination. And there's a hierarchical model, the Internet Protocol stack model. And at the source you have application, presentation, session, transport, network, link, and physical levels. And at the destination you have the same things. The network level is where you get routers, the link layer is where you get link layer switches, and the physical level you either have cable or wireless. And what happens is the process is top down at the source. And it's the logic there that determines what happens. The software drives the hardware. It's bottom up at the destination. And so what happens is you type in a message at the top, which is what you want to send. It goes down. It gets reinterpreted all the way down. It gets other stuff added in, like addresses get added in. It gets broken up into packets. And then it gets sent along from the source to there, and then it goes up. And the effect is it goes down, it goes along, it goes up, and the effect is the same level action like there. The effect is it goes from the source to the destination at the same level, but the way that happened is it chained down through all of these processes to the bottom. It then went along at the bottom level, and then it chained up, and the effect is the same level outcome. Encapsulation takes place. Extra information is added at each level on the way down and stripped on the way up. So it's broken into packets with addresses and a whole lot of stuff that's added in and then taken off as it goes up. And an example I've already given. The computer might be doing a sorting project. So you've got a list of stuff and you want to sort it, and the list has got a certain logical structure which is written here in pseudocode. Now that pseudocode can then get written in any language you like, Fortran, whatever, Java, whatever. And in a computer, it's this logic that replaces physics equations as the driving logic. It's the logic which determines what's going to happen in the computer. And it's saying the physics enables it, but it doesn't decide what will happen. So, and the further point is you can't derive algorithms logic from physics. If you've got Maxwell's equations, that doesn't tell you anything about the quicksort algorithm. Physics does not tell you the nature of algorithms. Yes, it's the logic, for instance, in this case, a quicksort that drives what happens at the higher levels and hence at the lower levels because it chains down in the way that I've said. The underlying physics enable this, but it dances to the tune of the abstract logic which you feed in at the higher levels, which gets embodied in particular patterns of energy states at the micro level. And so this is the way that the whole computer system works, and we can understand it fully because we've designed them and we've made them. And I've said the real magic in computers are the compilers which chain down the higher level stuff to the next, to the next, to the next, and which is explicitly the way that the information goes from the top level to the next one down, the next one down, and the next one down. So what computers illustrate is the causal efficacy of abstract entities. Programs and algorithms are not physical things, they're abstract. Let me just give another example of this. A book. In the old days, we thought of a book as writing on paper, and we thought of the paper object as being the book. Nowadays we know that a book can be in digital form, you can read it and so on, you can buy it on the internet in electronic form, and it's never in a hardware form. So what is the book? It's not the thing in paper, it's the abstract entity which is represented. It's the equivalence class of all of these representations, and it's the same with the program here. It's not equivalent to any of those specific representations. It's the equivalence class of all those representations. That abstract thing is what the computer program actually is. Through their realization of digital systems, they have causal influence on the physical world, like, for instance, creating jumbo jet airliners. Hence, it's not true that only material entities have causal powers in the real world. Okay, the brain. Now, a very good example of top-down action is vision. The visual system does not work by information going in from the eye to the visual areas and then being interpreted. The simple bottom-up thing is you've got photons impinging on the retina, it's fed through to the brain, and it projects an image on the back of the brain, that old picture. That's not what takes place. What rather takes place is there's an ongoing process whereby the cortex predicts what should be seen, fills in missing data, and interprets what's seen on the basis of expectations in the current context. In fact, this is top-down action. The cortex is feeding far more information through to the thalamus, which is the relay station, than the stuff coming in from the retinas. It can be demonstrated via visual illusions. The mind determines what you see in a top-down way, facilitated by reciprocal connections in the brain. And so let's just look at a few examples. This looks three-dimensional. It's not three-dimensional, it's two-dimensional. This is the three-dimensional interpretation. We basically can't help seeing it as three-dimensional, even though it's two-dimensional. This is this wonderful one. How many triangles are there in that picture? There aren't any triangles in the picture. What you've got is things like this and things like that, and you think you're seeing three triangles. You can't help yourself seeing those triangles. The mind fills in what's not there. There are no triangles there. It's not that you think you see triangles. You see triangles. Okay. This one, the famous one, those orange circles are exactly the same size, although they don't look it. The mind interprets size in relation to context, and this is a wonderful one here. It looks like it's going backwards and forwards. Nothing is going backwards and forwards. What is happening is things are flashing there and things are flashing there. Nothing is actually going backwards and forwards. And this one here, everyone with normal vision sees a person walking. It's a perceptual phenomenon which is very robust, but in fact it's simply a set of 12 lights which are moving in a particular way, but there's nothing actually, not a person moving. Now, this has been studied in great detail, and this is a typical example from Nature Neuroscience. Reentrant or feedback pathways between cortical areas carry rich and varied information about behavioral context, including attention, expectation, perceptual tasks, working memory, and motor commands. Neurons receiving such inputs effectively function as adaptive processes that are able to assume different functional states according to the task being executed. Recent data suggests that the selection of particular inputs representing different components of an association field enable neurons to take on different functional roles. So this review discusses the various top-down influences exerted on the visual cortical pathways and highlight the dynamic nature of the receptive field, which allows neurons to carry information that is relevant to the current perceptual demands. This is the kind of neuroscience you can do to underlie that. And goals and intentions. You have a purpose, specific exercise plan. You get some instructions, intentions in the person there. The muscles go to motion. Oops. And what is happening there is the thing I've already said before. Your purpose is leading to intentions, which are leading to purpose, and it leads to electrons flowing through your muscles according to the plan in the instructor's mind. So the flow is from the plan in the instructor's mind to the electrons flowing in muscles. This is top-down causation from a concept to motion of electrons in the muscles. And again, exactly as in computers, the electrons don't cause this pattern, they allow it to happen. And the brain in a social context. Society affects individual minds by setting the context in which they develop, through roles and role models, through formal teaching methods in schools, through informal interactions with parents and peers, through news and social media, and through social creations such as laws and money. And in particular, society shapes neural connections in the brain so that you will speak English or Chinese. I'm speaking to you in English. Why? Because the society in which I was brought up trained my neural connections in my brain to respond to English. That's top-down action from the level of society to the details of neural connections in my brain. And so roles and role models in society are examples which heavily influence how individuals act in any social context. And there's a whole lot of stuff about this. There's a whole subject of social neuroscience, and this is a very nice one from Nature. More hippocampal neurons in adult mice living in an enriched environment. If you take mice and put them in a dull environment, they don't develop a very good brain. If you put them in an environment where there's lots of interesting things to do, they get many more neural connections in their brain. and social influence on neuroplasticity, stress and interventions to promote well-being. Experiential factors shape the neural circuits underlying social and emotional behavior. So experiential factors shape the neural circuits from the prenatal period to the end of life. Although the precise mechanism of plasticity is still not fully understood, moderate to severe stress appears to increase the growth of several sectors of the amygdala, whereas the effects in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex tend to be opposite. Structural and functional change of the brain have been observed with cognitive therapy and certain forms of meditation, and lead to the suggestion that well-being and other prosocial characteristics might be enhanced through training. Again, it's an example of non-physical influences which have a physical influence. If you meditate, it can change the quality of connections in your brain. And a fascinating one is placebos. Placebos have got no active ingredients, but they can help shape your body. They can help relieve pain. Where there's no active microbiology ingredient, so the bottom-up thing cannot work because there isn't any active ingredient to work in a bottom-up way. It's the mind's belief in the medicine that mitigates chronic pain. And the fascinating thing, it works even when the patient knows that they are placebos. There's a recent Nature article in which researchers gave people placebos and told them they were placebos, and it still relieved pain in their bodies. So the internal functioning of the mind has crucial top-down elements, for example, in the way perceptions work. It is also ubiquitously affected by the society in which it's embedded, whereby social conditions such as language spoken shape the details of neural connections. So the effectiveness of consciousness, there's rationality and understanding, there's feelings and intentions, and there's social constructions such as law and money. Money is a social construction. It doesn't, the physical thing, the paper, is not what causes the effect of money. It's the fact that it's embedded in a social system whereby that piece of paper can be exchanged with other people. So, in fact, the causal effect of his money is not because of the nature of the money, it's because of the society in which it's embedded. All of this, concepts are not the same as brain states. They can be represented in many different ways. It's the same kind of thing. You can get the same ideas represented in the brain in many, many different ways in the neural networks. Many different neural network connections will give you the same higher level behavior. All of these rationality, feelings, and social systems are causally efficient. They affect the nature of physical objects in the world. And these functions are based on the neuronal structure and enabled by the underlying physics. And so this aircraft exists because someone planned it and designed it. So the human mind was causally effective in creating that object. And that's top-down action from the mind into all of the billions of atoms which make up that aircraft. So plans for a jumbo jet aircraft result in billions of atoms being deployed to create the aircraft in accordance with these plans, intelligent top-down causation. It's a non-trivial example. It costs a great deal of money to employ experts in aerodynamics, structures, materials, fuels, lubrication, controls and so on to design and then to manufacture the aircraft in accordance with those plans. And the plan, so some people say, but the plan is nothing but the designer's brain state. Well, firstly, with something like the jumbo jet, nobody knows the whole thing. Only people know parts of it. There isn't any individual who knows the whole design of that thing. The plan is not equivalent to any single person's brain state. It is an abstract, hierarchically structured equivalence class of representation, spoken, drawn, in computers and brains and so on, that together comprise the design. It's clearly causally effective because the aircraft wouldn't exist without it. It couldn't occur without language and mathematics as well as the social systems in which it's embodied. And equations. A lot of people in the physics department and mathematics department understand equations are causally effective in the real world because we use them. And Maxwell's equations, the equations, are an abstract entity. It's Maxwell's understanding of his equations which led to the existence of telephones, cell phones, all the rest of it. So, and the Maxwell's equations are a true description of the real world. But the point that I'm saying, it's not just that the physics enables this thing to work, it's that Maxwell had the equations in his mind as abstract things which caused these to come into existence. Maxwell's theory is not the same as any single person's brain state. It can be represented in many ways in formalisms. That this abstract theory has altered physical configurations in the real world and hence is causally effective. And then finally, ethics. This is the natural sciences side. On the social sciences side, the topmost level, causal level, is ethics. Now, why do I say that? Because ethics are constraints on what happens below. I've been emphasizing that things are constraints. And what is acceptable to you in social terms and psychological terms depends on your ethical stance. Okay? The highest level of intention, values, or ethics is causally effective because this is the choice of criteria for what are acceptable goals and so controls all the lower level goal choices. If you think it's acceptable to let off a nuclear bomb over an enemy city, then that will have consequences in the real world. It's your ethical stance which decides whether this is going to happen or not happen. So ethics is causally effective. So the causal efficacy of thoughts. Thoughts have the capacity to change the world around us, so do values. This is top-down action from the brain to all the atoms affected by the human mind, which is the causal power of technology, which transforms human life and the world. So my conclusion is that the emergence of complex systems takes place on evolutionary, developmental, and functional timescales. Each requires top-down causation, raising issues of adaptation and levels of selection in the case of evolution, epigenetic effects in the case of development, and the causal power of non-physical entities in the real world in the third case, such as theories, thoughts, and social conventions. And I emphasize again, people freak out and say, but you're saying the physics is being overwritten. The physics is not being overwritten. The physics is being channeled to make this happen. It's not being overwritten in any way. I want to return to Francis Crick and the astonishing hypothesis. He said, you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Now, if you're a real reductionist, that's a ridiculous statement. Why? Because nerve cells and molecules are made of electrons plus proton and neutrons, which are in the cells made of quarks. Crick chooses the level of nerve cells as rock bottom because that's the bottom level for his discipline. That's a totally illegitimate move if you're a reductionist. Hardline reductionists will say to him, how come you're assigning nerve cells real causal powers when their behavior is no more than the behavior of electrons that convey neural signals? What he's doing is he's drawing a line there and he's saying, I'm going to have bottom-up action from there on, and I'm going to ignore the fact that when you have electrons flowing, and when you've got the processes in the brain taking place, they are controlling how electrons flow. And so he is neglecting. If you really believe in bottom-up causation, you can't assign an intermediate level like this causal powers. It's the electron are doing the real work, and they are just vibrations of superstrings. But neuroscientists believe that neurons indeed do real work. This is only possible if they act down to channel and control the flow of electrons in neural axons. So just like in a computer, the computer program acts down to control the flow of electrons. If you believe Francis Crick's belief that neurons are doing real work, they are controlling the flow of electrons in axons. That is, Crick's view can only be true if top-down causation takes place from the neuron to the electron level. And if that's so, the case for top-down causation is vindicated. It underlies the success of neuroscience, because neuroscience depends on understanding the flow of electrons through neurons. And so the pattern of connection of the neurons controls which electrons flow through which axons and so on. And so, in fact, actually causation also goes from neurons to electrons, if you believe Crick's position, and from the mind to neurons. And so, in fact, the real thing is that the mind goes down to neurons, goes down to protons and electrons. There's top-down causation all the way. And the level of neurons does work, the level of genes do work, and so does your mind, your thoughts, and your imagination. Each of these levels is real, has causal powers in its own right, and control levels. Merlin Donald, who's written about this a lot, is right, and Crick is dead wrong. All levels are equally real and all have causal powers. There's no preferred level, as Dennis Noble has written in his book The Music of Life and elsewhere. Because, as I said, if the level of neurons has real causal power, you have then all the other levels must have, because you can't draw an arbitrary level. Either you say that the neurons have causal power, or you say only the bottommost level has causal power. Now, if you say only the bottommost level has causal power, you're in trouble, because we don't know what the bottommost level is. It might be superstrings or it might not be superstrings. So there's overwhelming evidence for top-down causation in physics, chemistry, biology, society, and the mind. It's taking place everywhere all the time. Despite this, some people deny it exists. The next lecture will consider the key objections against it and show how they fail. And I've got one more little exercise for you. If you've seen this before, keep quiet. If you haven't, this is a proof of top-down effects in reading. Context drives the process of reading. Reading is not a bottom-up process of reading letter by letter, putting them together to get words and so on. Read the following statement once, and as you are doing so, count the number of times the letter F appears. Final folios seem to result from years of dutiful study of texts along with years of scientific experience. So how many Fs are there in there?
5, 6,
7, 6? Any takers? The answer is 8. And the thing about it is, if you're a native English reader, if you're not a native English reader, it won't work. But if you're a native English reader, you don't see the ofs. The mind, those 3 ofs, you don't even see them, because your mind skips over them and doesn't even register that. Your mind assumes that they are there, because reading is not a top-down process. It's a holistic process where you read phrases, predicting what will be there, and skipping words as you read along. So those are the words. The correct answer is 8. Your mind skips words when reading and you don't even see them. And so that is what I wanted to do today. I wanted to give you an idea of how I see top-down causation. I wanted to give you sufficient examples, from a few from physics, a lot from biology, a lot from the mind, just to say, and from computers, to say once you start looking for it, it's everywhere around us, because everything is contextual actually. And as I said to begin with, we kind of, as physicists, we try to persuade ourselves it doesn't happen because we think of an isolated laboratory. We try to isolate a system from everything else, and then we say in that isolated system only bottom-up effects occur. Well, nothing can actually be isolated, actually, in the real world. And in the second place, that system in the laboratory wouldn't be there unless the mind hadn't designed it and made it. So the system in the laboratory is already an example of top-down causation.